Hello everybody and welcome back. This is a set review for Oath of the Gatewatch. I do want to preface this whole thing by saying thank you to anybody who's watching. I don't really do this for any likes or views or anything like that. I just do it to kind of get my ideas on the new set out there and kind of see if anybody has any different or similar views on these cards. Pre-release is about a week away, a little less than a week, so it's worth getting your views out there and seeing who agrees and disagrees, just to kind of tease your brain about the new set, get you thinking what cards are good, what cards are not. Since Oath of the Gatewatch is bringing a pretty new, not too revolutionary, but a new dynamic to deck building, I'm going to go ahead and start off with the lands here and move into the colorless cards and then finish up with all the actual colored cards in the set. It makes sense to talk about the lands because of the new change, and we should jump right into that. Before we see any of the new cards, we'll talk about two things. First off, the draft format is going to be small, small, big, so we're going to see 2 packs of Oath of the Gatewatch and only 1 pack of Battle for Zendikar. So you're not going to have to play against quadruple Nettle Drones anymore or Eldrazi Sky Spawners for days. You're going to see mostly new cards. I believe Magic has compensated, or Wizards has compensated, for the 2 small sets by including more cards in the small set. It's still small, but I think there have been more cards in this set than there are in the traditional small set, which is good, so the redundancy of decks will be on a minimum, and we are still going to see that 1 pack of Battle for Zendikar, but synergies are going to be based mostly on what we draft in the first 2 packs rather than the second 2 packs. The second thing we should talk about before we move on is the change to the colorless mana symbol. This symbol right here is now considered the colorless mana symbol. So if something produces this, you can use that to pay costs that have this symbol in it. You can also use this to pay for generic costs, but you cannot use this to pay for colored costs. So for instance, if something costs 1 green, you still cannot use this. This can be used for either generic mana or to pay for costs that include this symbol in it. Generic mana hasn't changed. You can use the colorless mana to produce it, but now there is a distinction between what is generic and what is colorless. This is more of a rules change just for clarification's sake, but Wizards has said that it does open up possibilities in design and deck building, which we will see, because this symbol does kind of leave certain restraints on what you can and cannot play in your deck if you have cards that cost colorless mana. We'll see that later on, but right now we're looking at lands and their functions in Oath of the Gatewatch. The very first thing we should talk about are the wastes. Now, this is a new basic land, but notice that it does not have a basic land type. This is not a waste type land or anything like that, whereas something like a forest has the subtype forest and is a basic land. That means cards like Evolving Wilds, and I'm sorry I didn't put a picture up, cards like Evolving Wilds say that you can go fetch a basic land, which lets you grab a waste from your deck. However, cards that reference basic land types do not include waste because they do not have a type. For example, Converge. Converge says different colors. How many different colors did you spend to cast it? Well, waste does not produce colored mana. It produces colorless mana. So this does not count towards Converge. Same with things like Sunburst for older mechanics. Now there are 2 different wastes. One that depicts Kozilek. I believe Kozilek is on the left. One that predicts or depicts Ulamog's kind of wreckage of Zendikar, which is pretty neat. It is worth noting, and in fact it is essential to know that these will be included in the draft. There will not be a preset number that your store will provide that you can just slot into your deck however you want. If you need wastes in your deck, you will have to draft them, which can be difficult because even though there are 2 of them at common, you may not see them. I imagine they're not going to go very highly unless somebody is very, very all in on a colorless deck, or they drafted Kozilek and they just want to make sure that they can cast them. But you should be able to get these pretty late, but they are a priority if you need them. They also look amazing. They will be full art, but the takeaway here is that there are 2 of them, and they will be drafted. They will not be pulled out like your other full art lands at the back of the pack. They are part of the pack and must be drafted if you need to use them. The next land here at common is Holdout Settlement. This is an interesting one. Here we see the change. Usually this would say, or before this set, it would say add 1 to your mana pool. Now it says add colorless to your mana pool. Just a distinction that it doesn't add generic mana, it adds colorless mana. So if we're tapping this for colorless, we can use it to pay for generic costs or colorless costs, but we cannot use it to pay for colored costs. Now what this land does in addition to that is lets you tap this land as well as another creature, and you add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. In other words, it's a build your own Birds of Paradise or Sylvan Caryatid. This is great mana fix and lets you turn any creature at all, whether it's a token or just something, a utility creature that's not doing very much, lets you turn it into mana fixing. Now sometimes this is a little awkward because maybe you don't have a creature and you really need to cast a colored spell and you don't have the color for it, then Holdout Settlement won't do that for you. But 9 times out of 10 I imagine this is going to do what you want it to, that is fix your colors and let you cast colors of spells of other colors by using your creatures as a utility. Tapping a creature is a cost. It really is. So don't just willy-nilly tap your creatures and leave yourself defenseless. Time it right. Make sure you're using creatures that aren't going into combat. And use this whenever you need to splash colors or just fix your mana. I think it's a great land. And I'm actually surprised to see it at common here. I think it's going to be snatched up very quickly, and it's going to help build 3-4 color decks in this format. Next we have Unknown Shores, which is perfect for demonstrating the difference between colorless mana and generic mana, since previous to this reprint it would have both of them represented as this 1 on the same card, even though they meant different things. Unknown Shores itself is not an exciting card. It's another card that lets you splash a color, but I think it's a little bit worse, actually a good bit worse than Holdout Settlement. It does let you fix your colors, but it essentially sets you back a land if you're doing that, since you have to pay 1 and tap this land to do it. This is the type of card that is a necessary evil, but I think it's actually much better in this format than it was in Theros, because it does add that colorless, and Theros didn't have cards that needed colorless mana, whereas Unknown Shores will let you cast certain cards that do need colorless mana. I think Unknown Shores will be better this time around, but I still don't think it's that exciting. We also get Crumblin Vestige, which is a card I think is really unique and I really like. Now it enters the battlefield tapped, which is usually the downfall of a common land. But when it enters the battlefield, you can add any color of mana to your mana pool. Additionally, you can tap it to add colorless mana. So this is a colorless utility land that gets you a one-time colored mana of your choice. That means you can use it to fix colors. You can use it immediately even though it comes in tapped. It's only going to give you that colored mana once. This can be a problem sometimes if, for instance, you need to splash a card, but you can't wait to play your Vestige just because you need more land on the field. Sometimes you have to play this Vestige without actually using the colored mana for anything useful. But the reason to include this in your deck is either A, I need the colorless mana that this produces, or I'm using it to splash a color. You don't always want this kind of card, but I think it's going to be useful when you want it, and I really like the flavor on it. Very interesting. Here we get a interesting cycle of lands, mostly because they're uncommon and they're not very good. I say that mostly for constructed purposes. I am evaluating these in limited, but they're wholly unplayable in constructed. They're actually pretty decent in limited. They are the allied colored lands, 1 in each allied colored combination. We have just 5 lands that don't do anything exciting, enter the battlefield tap but fix for 1 of 2 different colors. You know when you want these, and in fact these can be a sign that that color combination is open. If you're halfway through the pack and you're getting Tranquil Expanse in the pack, that means green-white might be a color combination that's open and you can draft it unattested. You know when you want these. The fact that they're uncommon means that A, they're not going to muck up the packs very much. You're not going to see too many of them. And B, it means that you're not just going to be able to jam 4 or 5 color decks with these lands. I think that's partially the reason for making them uncommon, is so that people aren't just snatching these and doing what they did in cons and making just 5 color decks that play all the best cards. Now, if you can get these and you need them, great. If you don't need the second color, there's no reason to run them. So just take these when you need them and use them as a sign to see what colors are open. Moving into the rare lands, we get the first one, a devoid land called Corrupted Crossroads. And by devoid land, I mean that it works with devoid cards. It is not itself devoid. It adds colorless mana, and essentially the second ability is a mana confluence for devoid spells. There's a huge number of devoid spells in this set, in addition to the ones that we saw in Battle for Zendikar. So, you know when you want this. If you're running a deck that is mostly white, doesn't have any devoid cards, has maybe 1 or 2, you don't need this. But if you're running mostly devoid cards, or I would say about half your deck is devoid, this works just fine. It fixes your mana when you need it, and when you don't need that colored mana anymore, you can tap it for colorless. So the colorless is relevant in this set, again, way more than it would be in another set. And this ability is relevant for mana fixing in the early game. Paying a life is a cost, as we saw with Mana Confluence. I drafted it a couple times, and a lot of times paying a life is a cost that is relevant to the game. So do not just go, just don't go crazy with paying life to activate costs if you don't need to. But take this card if you need it, and pass it if you don't. Seagate Wreckage is a card that I think is going to see constructed play. This adds colorless mana to your mana pool, as do most of the lands in this set, and it has an activated ability, a very good one. For 2 mana and a colorless mana, you can tap it to draw a card. The catch is that you can only activate the ability if you don't have any cards in your hand. Now, in Limited, games usually go to the point where players don't have cards in their hands, or at least good games do. So having something like this to kind of regain your tempo and refill your hand basically lets you draw 2 cards every turn, assuming that you can use both those cards. Also, it being a tap ability lets you use it on the upkeep to draw a card before you would naturally draw a card for your turn. That way you're definitely getting your 2 cards per turn. It essentially costs 4 mana, since you do have to tap Seagate Wreckage in addition to the other 3, and it does require a colorless source, which means that if your only way to produce colorless mana is through other colorless lands, you're going to be bogging your deck down a lot with colorless sources, since Seagate Wreckage is also a colorless source. So if you have heavy color requirements in your deck, you need to be careful running cards like Wreckage. Just make sure that if you are running it, you have a good number of colorless sources that aren't detracting from the colored sources you need in your deck. I think this card is first pick worthy in a draft. I think the ability is very relevant in Limited, and we'll see how it works in Constructed, whether it makes a wave or not. This one I'm a little less excited about, but I think it's still pretty decent. Ruins of Oran Reef comes into the battlefield tapped, and again adds colorless mana. It has an additional ability to put a 1/1 counter on a colorless creature that entered the battlefield this turn. I do want to point out that Two-Headed Giant has been in consideration for this set, so there are cards that work in conjunction with it. The second ability can put a 1/1 counter on your partner's creature that entered the battlefield that turn, since it doesn't specify it has to be your creature. I don't think this card is amazing. I do think it's fine. The ability to put 1/1 counters on creatures that enter the battlefield is good. It does kind of set you back a mana, because if you're banking on the second ability, you're not using it for the mana, which is fine if that's what you want to be doing. I think this is not really a card you want to pick first in a draft, but something that you want to pick up later if you're already in a deck that has a bunch of colorless cards. So I could see myself passing this quite often, and I very rarely think I'm going to pick it up in draft. It could be good in a lot of sealed decks if you're just building a deck that's all colorless creatures and you notice that you have one of these. But other than that, I don't think it's too exciting, but definitely a utility land that's worth grabbing if you're in the deck that wants it. Here we get the rest of our cycle of man lands, finally. These are in enemy colors, and they do fix for colors that are not represented by the uncommon dual lands that we just saw. So, I'm sorry, I said enemy colors, I believe allied colors. Clearly don't know the difference. But we'll start with Wandering Fumarole because this is the one that I think most people are excited about, and I think it's great in draft too, even though people are considering it in constructed. This one is blue-red. They all enter the battlefield tapped, and for 4 mana, 1 blue, 1 red, 2 generic, you can make it become a 1/4 for the turn. The ability is pay 0, or activate it whenever you want, basically, and switch the power and toughness. So if you are planning to attack with this, it can attack as a 4/1. It becomes more fragile because it has 1 toughness. But, that's a lot of damage coming from a land. Now, there are a couple weird things you have to watch out for this. For instance, if you go to activate the ability and your opponent responds by, for instance, pinging this a damage with some sort of card, then it will die when it switches because it'll already have a damage marked on it, and it'll be a 4/1 with 1 damage. So you have to watch out for things like that. But I think a well-versed player is going to be very, very careful about when they activate this card and when they activate the ability. You can activate the ability multiple times too. It doesn't cost anything to do it. So if things are getting kind of weird, you can switch it back to a 1/4 if your opponent tries to remove it with like burn base damage. But yeah, a land that can defend and a land that can attack very well is very versatile and in colors that people really like to play in this set. So I can see this going very early. Definitely a first pickable land in most decks, and at the very least it's color fixing if you need it. Hissin Quagmire is the black-green one, and for 3 mana it becomes a 2/2 black and green Death Touch creature. Death Touch is relevant in Limited since a lot of, most of your winning cards are going to be creatures. Death Touch kind of holds those creatures off. Now, this isn't the most busted thing, but it is just fine on a land. It's great, actually. If you have the open mana to animate it, your opponent's going to have to be careful about attacking, and just leaving this open is enough to dissuade your opponent from attacking at all sometimes. People really don't like to swing into Death Touch things, so depending on who your player, Hissin Quagmire can do a lot more work than it's intended. It also attacks well for the same reason that people don't like to block Death Touch creatures, but I would happily trade a 2/2 for this thing if my opponent swung at me with it. I think it's just fine, and as with the Fumarole and all the other man lands, it is mana fixing even if you don't plan on using the ability too often. If, however, you can't use the second color, for instance, I'm in a black deck, obviously there's no reason to even pick this card because you can't even animate it, and the green mana doesn't do anything for you. Finally, we get Needle Spires, aka also known on the internet as Indignation Cliffs. That was a poor mock-up. I think somebody just took a picture from a video and gave it its own ability. They were actually quite close, but not quite the same as Needle Spires. This is the red-white one, and for 4 mana, this one becomes a 2/1 Double Striker. Double Striker is very powerful and limited because it lets you just push in tons of damage, or it lets you eat up creatures. Also, as we'll see with some of the later cards in the other videos, there are a lot of abilities that turn your lands into 0/0s with 3 counters on it. This was something we saw with Shambling Vents and Lumbering Falls, is if your creature has been, for instance, awakened, or one of those abilities has made it a 0/0 with 3 counters on it, and you activate the ability, the creature's base power and toughness becomes 2/1 with the additional 3 counters on it. So if you animate this or awaken it, or do both, I should say, it's technically a 5/4 Double Striker, which is incredible. I love Double Strikers, and I think more than any others, I think Wandering Fumarole is going to have the biggest long-term splash, but I think Needle Spires is going to be the most relevant in Limited. Double Strike is just that good sometimes. Finally, we have a mythic rare land here with Mirror Pool. Another colorless producer. This one enters the battlefield tapped, and it has 2 utility abilities on it. The first one costs 3, one of which has to be colorless, and you sacrifice Mirror Pool, tap it, and copy an instant or sorcery you control, and of course you can change new targets. Remember that if you're copying an instant or sorcery, you do not have to pay the costs again for that copy. For instance, if you had something like Altar's Reap that required you to sacrifice a creature in order to cast it, and you copy it, you do not have to sacrifice a second creature for the copy of Altar's Reap. You would just draw 4 cards with the 1 sacrificed creature. That's just an example. I'm not saying you should ever use your mirror pool to Altar's Reap, but if that's what you have to do, you have to do. Also, we have the 5 mana ability, which also requires a colorless and lets you sacrifice Mirror Pool to basically copy a creature that you control. You get a token that is an exact copy of target creature you control. Both of these abilities specify you control, so you can't copy your opponent's spells or creatures, and in a 2-headed giant game, you can't copy your partner's stuff either. I think Mirror Pool's great. The versatility of its 2 abilities let it slot into creature decks the same way it lets you slot into spell-heavy decks. So it has utility in pretty much any deck you can play it. Also having the ability to produce that colorless mana, as I've already said 4 or 5 times this video, is useful in this set when you need it. This is a mythic, so you won't see it very often. You won't have to play against it very often, but it is something that is just versatile enough to pretty much put in any deck, and I think I'd be pretty excited to open it regardless of what deck I'm playing. And then you have to talk about the expeditions, right? You're never going to pull one. I've actually had the fortune of pulling 2 expeditions, one from a booster box and one in draft, but they both happen to be the same one, a Blood Crypt, which I'm definitely not complaining about, but we'll test my luck with this next set. Here we're looking at the 10 filter lands, some of the best lands I think have ever been printed, some of the most exciting lands, and while I wish they were reprinted in the set and not as expeditions so I could actually get my hands on them, I think they're fantastic and they look absolutely gorgeous. If you pull one of these, then you know it fits in your deck perfectly. If you don't, then I'm sorry, but they look beautiful. The Cascade buffs especially is just absolutely gorgeous, but they look great and they're very, very good, and if you have one, if you pull them, then you can probably find a place to use them, whether it's EDH or they even get modern played a little bit, cube, stuff like that. But yeah, there you go, the 10 filter lands, and then we have 10 others, 4 of which are kind of your land destruction lands like Dust Bowl, ones that are mostly just flavorful for the set. Wasteland is the big money card, I believe, here, with Star City having it tagged at $300, I believe. Maybe that's Strip Mine, but I believe it's Wasteland. Speaking of which, we have Strip Mine for all the people who despise fun and want to make you miserable. And then we have what I'm not going to say I'd ever be disappointed to pull an expedition, but Tectonic Edge might leave you grumbling a little bit. Since this is actually an uncommon card, I would still be happy to pull it, though, just because of how rare an expedition is. But you could do better than Tectonic Edge. And finally, we have the 6 others, which is kind of just a grab bag. We have Ancient Tomb, which if you pull and draft, I suggest you play it because Ancient Tomb is awesome and lets you do broken things. Horizon Canopy being a much needed reprint that nobody seems to have or can get a hand on. Fits into a lot of modern decks, but is in just such short supply. Not that Expedition is going to really change that, but it's just an altogether fantastic land. Mana Confluence, I believe, is the newest addition to this list. I'm sorry, the newest card to be printed as an expedition, since it was just printed in Journey into Nyx not that long ago. Great all-around useful land, City of Brass type effect, but as with any of them, be very happy to pull this. Forbidden Orchard sees play in Eternal formats. If you pulled in draft, it's actually probably not the best thing in the world. It's actually probably the worst of the lands in draft, but let's be honest, you're not really playing it in draft, and you already won anyway if you pull this. We get this kind of awkward land here. Core Haven is more of a flavor land for the set, I would say. But you know, expeditions are expeditions. You can get some value out of this, even if it's not the most exciting one. And finally, as soon as we're done zooming in, we have Eye of Ugin, which is on the rise right now because of certain modern decks that have been playing it. But honestly, Eye of Ugin's been played in Tron and KCI decks anyway. Very useful land in certain decks, and very gorgeous art on this. Very incredible. So there you go with the expeditions. Good luck pulling them. If I know a lot of people have been going all in on booster boxes for Battle for Zendikar, so if you're doing the same with Oath of the Gatewatch, I wish you the best of luck on pulling one of these ones. Hopefully you get the Wasteland or the Horizon Canopy, something like that. But honestly, I'd be happy with any of them. Anyway, that's it for the lands from the set. One takeaway here is that, yeah, you're going to have to take consideration into your deck building. If you have cards that cost a lot of colorless mana, you are going to have to draft things like Wastes or Colorless Sources, Unknown Shores, stuff like that. You're going to have to draft them a lot higher because there's a chance that they don't come back around to you. Maybe other people need them. And we'll see later on, there are a lot of cards that produce colorless. There are a lot of cards that require colorless. So it adds this dynamic to draft that wasn't in Battle for Zendikar, and definitely wasn't in any set before it. As far as Limited's concerned, the colorless mana is in the cost of cards is essentially like splashing a 6th color, because you may need to put cards like Wastes and stuff in, but it's good that a lot of the common lands and mostly the common lands let you produce colorless mana in addition to colored mana with certain requirements, which is great. So I don't think it's going to be impossible to pull off whatever you want to do in draft, but I do think you're going to need to consider what your deck wants to look like and what you need a lot more this time around. You might need to take something like a Waste over a much better card just so that you can play your Kozilek or what have you. But that being said, thank you guys for watching. Let me know in the comments below what you think. Also, let me know, are you happy pulling a Tectonic Edge? If that's your expedition, how do you feel about that? But, yeah, if you think I'm over-evaluating, under-evaluating, or if I just missed something altogether, maybe a unique combination of cards that I haven't considered, haven't pointed out, please let me know in the comments below. And please stay tuned for the rest of the Oath of the Gatewatch spoilers. Not spoilers, but evaluations that I'm going to be putting up in the other videos. Thank you all for watching, and I'll get back to you soon.